Hello, hello, and welcome everyone. Happy New Year to you all. Thank you all for joining the first K-12-6 webinar of the year for 2025, titled PowerSchool Got Hacked, Now What? Produced in partnership with the 74. We'll give everyone a few minutes to jump in. In the chat, please take the opportunity to introduce yourself and let us know where you guys are tuning in from. Welcome, Andrew. Welcome, Russell. Thank you all for joining today. Excellent, excellent. Next slide, Doug. K-12-6 is a Global Resilience Federation member community. K-12-6 is a real-time cyber threat intelligence sharing hub exclusively to schools to aid in preventing and mitigating cyber threats. We serve as the K-12 education facility subsector, information sharing and analysis center, only nonprofit dedicated solely to K-12 cybersecurity resilience and capacity building. Members include school districts, charters, independent schools, region education agencies, and state education agencies as well. For more information, please visit the link here at the bottom of this slide. Just a quick update. We'd love for you all to join us in San Diego this year. We're just a few weeks away, February 24th to February 26th. You can check out this link here on our website as well as on the slide. You have an opportunity to learn from K-12-6 practitioners on the front lines, learn with leading cybersecurity vendors, pre-conference tickets facilitated by CISA, and much more. The question everyone asks, is this webinar recorded? Absolutely. After the webinar is over, you'll receive a link to the recording with slides via your email, shortly after the webinar. If you have any comments, please remember that you guys are going to be muted. Feel free to drop them here in the chat. On the bottom in your Zoom toolbar, you also have a Q&A function. Please feel free to drop a question for that in that panel. And afterwards, we'd love your feedback. We'll drop a QR link. We promise it's not spam. And we'll be happy to hear from you. Thank you. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mark Racine. Thank you all.
I think we're introducing Mark Keebler, or
this is going to become an issue of the day. But hello, there are two Marks on the call today. All good. My name is Mark Kyrelieber. I'm an investigative reporter at the 74. It's a national K-12 education news website where I've been conducting in-depth research on K-12 cybersecurity. This includes a forthcoming investigation coming out very soon regarding schools' cybersecurity and cyber attack response efforts nationwide. So be sure to watch out for that. Today, we're going to discuss what we know and about how PowerSchool got hacked, who was affected, and the steps school districts, students, and parents must take to keep their communities and themselves safe. I'm joined by a fascinating panel of experts who agreed on short notice to share their wisdom with us today. So many thanks for all of the participants who agreed to jump on this timely call. We have Doug Levin. He's the co-founder and national director of K-12-6. Doug brings in-depth knowledge on the digital threat landscape facing K-12 schools and is a go-to resource for educators who are trying to better manage their cybersecurity risks. I also have Amelia Vance, the president of Public Interest Privacy Center. Amelia is an attorney and an expert in privacy ethics and law as it applies to the education sector. I also have Mark Racine, the co-founder of Rooted Solutions, which is a Boston-based consulting firm specializing in education technology strategy. Previously, Mark served as the Chief Information Officer for Boston Public Schools for more than a decade. I also have Wesley Lombardo. He's the Technology Director at Maryville City Schools in Tennessee. He also maintains the edtechirl.com blog and co-hosts the Zero Breach Zone podcast. So please be sure to check those out. We did invite PowerSchool to participate, but the company did decline our invitation. We did receive an email statement and a spokesperson told me that the company is working to complete its investigation of the incident and are coordinating with districts and schools to provide more information and resources, including credit monitoring and identity theft protection services, if applicable. One quick note is we do plan to ask facilitate a few audience questions at the end of this call. So if you could please drop those questions into the chat, I'll be watching for them and will be sure to ask them at the end. With that note, I'll mention that this is a massive breach. We're talking about a software company whose tools are used to support the learning of more than 50 million students across the country. And with that, I hope to turn the conversation to Doug Levin. I'm hoping that you can give a brief primer on what we know about what happened and how the company responded to the attack. Was this an inevitable event? Was it predictable? What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Mark. I'll try to keep this brief because I know we have a lot to cover. I mean, in short, what the company has communicated is that late in December, around December 19th, a malicious threat actor compromised one of their internal systems via a subcontractor, right? Did some reconnaissance, and then on or about December 22nd, carried out an attack against the customer base of the PowerSchool student information system product, exfiltrating data about both students and teachers. Just a subset of what was included in that system, but certainly significant nonetheless. On or about the 28th of December, that threat actor made an extortion demand to PowerSchool regarding, to keep the data from being released and abused on the dark web. It appears that PowerSchool may have paid that extortion demand. And then they initiated their incident response activities at that time. And then on January 7th, they began to notify customers of PowerSchool, frankly, whether they were customers of the student information system product or other products, of the incident. On the following 2 days, PowerSchool held briefings with customers, answering questions and providing some additional details. One of the things that we know is they've hired the firm CrowdStrike, which some may know, to conduct a detailed independent forensic analysis of what happened. They said they're expecting that report on or about January 17th. I wouldn't be surprised if it comes a little bit later, but they have promised to share that report with customers. And I would anticipate in that report we'll end up learning a lot more about the specific way that the initial access was gained and how the attack was carried out. The question of was something like this inevitable? I would say there were many things that PowerSchool should be lauded for. This issue of cybersecurity is not one that was new to the company. They have been getting annual SOC 2 Type 2 audits. They were ISO 27001 certified. A year ago, August, they were on stage at the White House at a K-12 cybersecurity event hosted by the First Lady and attended by the Secretary of Education and the Secretary of Homeland Security, as well as the Director of CISA. In fact, in many ways, one could argue they were going sort of above and beyond what we see from many other K-12 vendors. Of course, this was not a rock solid assurance that nothing could ever go wrong. There are no 100% guarantees in cybersecurity. And frankly, we've seen large multinational corporations, governments, countries even fall victim to these sorts of incidents. I think following that, following that, I think they've also tried to communicate relatively promptly here and relatively forthrightly. I will say, however, now that it does appear that They're being a little bit more careful in their public statements. We have seen reports of at least 3 lawsuits that have been filed against the company related specifically to this incident. I'm sure that has something to do with it. And I would say, broadly speaking, while one couldn't have predicted that PowerSchool itself may have been the source of an incident like this facing school systems, just 1 month ago, I actually hosted a webinar where I was talking about trends in K-12 cybersecurity. And one of the top 5 trends I called out was third-party vendor risk. And I would note that large numbers of vendors have remote access to sensitive school IT systems as part of their contracts to maintain those systems and keep them updated and functioning. And that access has the potential to be abused. I think, what's maybe a little bit different here than some other sorts of incidents is the scope of this incident. While PowerSchool itself serves an enormous number of customers, I'm actually not sure how many may have been wrapped up in this particular incident. Again, it was limited to the student information system. I will say they affected customers in the US and Canada. And obviously, we're talking specifically about the US here, but there are broader implications. So that, this could have happened to others. It may happen to other vendors as well. We have seen other vendor incidents.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm hoping to turn to Mark Racine actually, and talk a little bit about the types and the scope of the data that were breached. A student information system like this certainly maintains a large volume of data about students nationally, and from my understanding, we're talking about data that goes back more than a decade. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's a very tough question to answer because every customer is a little bit different in how they maintain their student information system. But for those who are not in the K-12 industry, the student information system is typically called the SIS. It's a type of system that every school district has, and it is kind of the heart of their data. It's really where you're maintaining all of your student data. There's some staff data in there depending on the district and the needs of the district. And then that's kind of where the data starts and then feeds all the other systems that are out there and is obviously used for state reporting and federal reporting. So there is a level of very sensitive information contained in the student information system. This particular attack exported the student table and the teacher table. So those are pretty sensitive tables on their own. But for the most part, you can think of those tables as being a roster of the students and staff within the district. Depending on the specifics of the district, there may be more or less data fields that are contained or populated. We are hearing reports, and I think Wesley and myself are working with school districts that did have Social Security number contained in their PowerSchool instance. Although that is not the norm, each school district would be the one to determine what data fields were contained in their PowerSchool instance on the student table. But we're not seeing things like transcript records. We're not seeing attendance records. Those are typically stored on a different table. So, when you compare this to other breaches of school districts, you've heard of some very devastating school district attacks where psychology reports, behavior reports, grades and attendance, everything is stolen. This was a rather, in comparison, a smaller subset of data. But what does make this very different is this was an enormous number of customers that were hit. We really don't have the full totality of how many districts and how many students were hit. We have heard reports of previous customers of PowerSchool that were also impacted by this. And then we're also hearing more and more districts are notifying former withdrawn alumni students because they would have been contained on the student table. I had somebody ask me the other day, why would former and withdrawn students be on the student table? We are federally required to maintain student records after you graduate. And so, you are seeing districts that have years, sometimes maybe decades of students contained on that student table that was withdrawn. So that's kind of the scope in a nutshell.
Awesome, thank you. And Amelia, I'm curious. I'm hoping you can discuss PowerSchool's unique role in the education sector. Mark just talked about how an SIS is a tool that's used by every school district in the country. What options do schools have if they aren't happy with the company's security safeguards?
Not a ton when it comes to the SIS. Unlike most ed tech companies that schools contract with, this acquiring the student information system often takes multiple years, requires competitive bids. And so many schools will have trouble if they do want to move away with actually being able to move to a new vendor. And in the meantime, they'll have to continue using the product because it's an essential product in districts.
Absolutely. And Wesley, you work in a school. Since the hack occurred, how has this affected your day-to-day job, and what steps have you taken in response?
Yeah. So the biggest thing so far has been kind of the uncertainty, because there's not been a whole lot of communication from PowerSchool, and what's been released has been still very general. And so we're still kind of looking and investigating kind of the depth and breadth of what happened, because we've not gotten the list of what actual students and teacher records were actually compromised. And so we're, you know, based on logs, it looks very expansive. And you mentioned kind of the things in the data set. It's a lot of things, like things ranging from, of course, social security numbers that everyone's concerned about, but also, parent names, contact information, addresses. There's some fields for medical alerts, just a variety of different things. And so we've been trying to take that kind of not so meaty responses and try to kind of temper the fear and uncertainty and doubt around it. But it is very wide reaching and still a lot of questions at this point.
Absolutely. Let's stay with you for a second, Wesley. You mentioned that we're still waiting to hear a lot of information from the company itself, right? They haven't, they've released a public statement. They've had these webinars with the school district company customers, but public information is still something that we're grasping for here. PowerSchool says the incident has been contained, and they do not anticipate the data being shared or made public by the threat actors. How much confidence should you and other folks put into the company's statements? What steps should you and other schools, parents, students, etc., take to proactively protect their own information?
Yeah, so personally, I was on the webinars that PowerSchool did the day after the notification, the 2 days after, and kind of the explanation of what happened is that they have a high level of faith that the attackers deleted the information because the attackers needed to maintain the trust in their business model. Was kind of the rationale. And so, for me, if I'm thinking about someone that's already not trustworthy and already, making poor choices in regards to other people's data, I'm not sure how much trust I place in that. So, at this point, part of me is waiting for that other shoe to drop of when that data becomes released later on. But in the meantime, we're starting to look at those kind of options of what can we do. So, everyone's first reaction is it's time for credit monitoring. And so, thinking about that, and then also on a practical side, notifications. So, mentioning having data that goes back decades, if we became a PowerSchool customer in 2010. And so I would be hard pressed to have solid contact information for a lot of those contacts that we had in school 15 years ago at this point.
Absolutely. Given that you just mentioned the need for maybe other school districts and for the company itself to submit breach notices to individuals who've had their information stolen, I'm hoping to pivot to Amelia real quick, and I'm hoping that she can offer a brief primer on the data privacy laws at play here. What legal obligation does PowerSchool have as a result of this attack? How about the individual school districts? What degree of communication and transparency should parents and frankly school leaders expect?
Absolutely. So I have to say, the more I looked into this and as I was talking to some of the districts and others I'm working with on this, it became clear how egregious this was in terms of the decisions that were made before the breach occurred. The legal obligations here are clear. the security requirements that they were missing have been standard and are codified in multiple laws. So, for example, the Federal Trade Commission does not allow for unfair or deceptive practices from companies. This is the primary way that the US regulates security. There was literally a settlement in 2022 with an ed tech company that had lax data security practices, in particular, a lack of multi-factor authentication. This is something that any reasonable company should have been aware of and been sure to comply with. And I would not be surprised if the FTC has already opened a case. But the FTC is one agency. They tend to do sort of broad statement cases given their limited resources. And so this doesn't necessarily assuage concerns about the other companies, because as we've mentioned, this is a huge company used by millions of students. And if they're not doing the basics on some of their systems, that is this much information easily downloadable without alerts from, at least some reports, a foreign IP address that they access the data from over multiple days, you have a lot of issues there. So some of the other legal stuff that applies, Children's Online Privacy Protection Act requires reasonable procedures to protect security and confidentiality. Again, widely understood in law and guidance everywhere that multi-factor authentication is part of that. State student privacy laws, we've had well over 140 pass over the past decade in addition to what already existed. And many of them require explicitly security measures. Some of them in the biggest states, New York, Texas, require third-party vendors to adopt measures that align with the NIST cybersecurity framework, which, spoiler, includes multi-factor authentication and other things that at least reportedly were missing here. You also have district contracts. If anyone was using the National Data Privacy Agreement from the Student Data Privacy Consortium, that includes, for example, in version 2, vendors to implement a recognized cybersecurity framework. So it is also required contractually. The problem here clearly isn't that there weren't sufficient laws, though the laws could be better, but that laws are only as good as their enforcement. And this is absolutely an indictment of the privacy and security enforcement that does exist. So many issues there. When it comes to breaches, it gets very complicated. PowerSchool did have an obligation to inform districts within a certain period of time. I know there have been several that have noted that the notification after PowerSchool was certainly aware that there was a breach because they'd gotten this request for money, exceeded what was required under at least one state law, certainly under some multi-state contracts. The tricky thing with these is usually breach notification, the clock starts ticking to when you have to inform your customers after you have confirmation that a breach has occurred. But again, if you're paying money, then I think a reasonable person would find that that clock has started ticking. So there are many, many, many legal issues here that have come up. And as Doug mentioned, there are lawsuits that have been filed, which, in addition to some of the things I just brought up, note that there's probably also a violation here of California's consumer privacy law. You now have 20 states that have their own consumer privacy law, and you better believe that these practices, highly unlikely to meet those laws' requirements. There's no reason why this should have happened.
Let's jump in and discuss PowerSchool's reported decision to pay a ransom. This isn't for any particular panelist, but anybody. I'm curious if the experts can discuss your thoughts on the company's apparent decision to pay that ransom. What does that say about the extent of the breach and the extent of the compromise? And what advice do you have for other vendors or schools who find themselves with a demand to pay $1 million in Bitcoin?
Well, to be clear, I don't think we know the amount of the extortion.
Absolutely true. I was just
Right. That was, yeah. So, look, I mean, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that anytime anyone in the K-12 sector is paying an extortion demand, it only increases the risk for everybody else, right? It encourages malicious actors to continue to target us and try to extort us, right? Either by using encryption to lock up our devices or stealing our data and trying to extort us to keep it from being leaked. I think Wesley also was right on the money. Any assurances that the data won't be further shared, I think, have to be taken with an enormous grain of salt. I think that it was probably a calculation that was done by the company as a way to risk liability, because the counter argument is that if they hadn't paid, that data would have been released on the dark web and maybe would be being abused, as we speak. I think it's certainly possible that it could show up there and be released at some point in the future. Or it could be used to target individual teachers and students directly via phishing or social engineering. And it may be difficult to kind of figure out where that information, sort of came from to allow those sorts of attacks. It does put the company in a bit of a, and even any organization between a rock and a hard place. But at the end of the day, to have a company as large and central to the industry as PowerSchool paying certainly is probably a net negative for the sector going forward, in my opinion.
Does anybody else have a thought or a perspective on the decision to pay that ransom?
I have zero thoughts because I hope I'm never in a position where I have to make that decision for my organization. I think everybody's going to have their opinions as to whether or not you can trust the bad guys who've stolen the data. And unfortunately, that level of trust is going to be very hard for us to accept. What I will say, though, is that, in the topic of PowerSchool's transparency is a very wide conversation right now and a growing conversation. I was very impressed with the level of detail that PowerSchool did give to us on the webinar. It is a level of transparency I have not seen yet. And even while my phone has been blowing up over the last 24 hours over another possible ed tech breach of a very large size that we have heard nothing about from the company themselves, to have the company CEO and CISO hold a webinar and give very, very detailed instruction or very, very detailed description of what happened and what they did in response is something that I think we should hold up all of our vendors to do in the future. And I hope that the bar that PowerSchool has set on that webinar is something we can carry forward.
Absolutely. And Amelia, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about the value of the data that is at play here. So it's become increasingly clear in the last few years that schools have become a primary target for cyber criminal groups in ransomware attacks and other types of cyber attacks. What value do threat actors see in children's sensitive information? And what steps can we take as a nation to make children's records less enticing to criminals?
Well, we can certainly take action to make sure that they're less accessible to criminals. That would help. I mean, as Doug mentioned, there is not a way to prevent breaches, but there was a district official I was talking to a number of years ago, and they said the key is don't leave the low-hanging fruit out there. There's so many just basic things, and many of these criminals tend to be lazy, and so they will go for whatever that bottom level is. When it comes to the sensitivity of this data, I remember a presentation from years ago where they were like, there's no social security number being shown. It's not a big deal. And I was saddened and appreciated the example a few years later of the Dark Overlord hack, where the hackers literally used telephone numbers to terrorize parents and kids, posted contact information on Twitter saying, here's a list of kids that pedophiles can go after. So even information that we think of as very innocuous can be used in incredibly harmful ways. I do have lots of questions in this case about the use of social security numbers. That's certainly been labeled as a problematic practice by the Social Security Administration, by Department of Education, and others for years. Most states removed any requirement to use SSN. Some have actually banned it for schools. And that's because when you have a breach like this, that's just an added factor, that you have that potential identity theft, where when you're dealing with kids, of course, a parent isn't checking their credit. And so you have social security numbers that can then be used to apply for credit or various things that can then, you know, end up a kid turns 18, applies for a credit card, and their credit is horrible. They're not able to do anything. And so just the fact that there is such a wide variety of data that was breached, and the fact that even that innocuous data can cause serious harms. When you have information about you out there, someone has some level of power over you. They can call you if they have your phone number. They can, you know, if they have your mental health records, we've talked about, extort or shame or limit your opportunities. And it's particularly important when we're dealing with kids who are learning and growing and making mistakes, that they have that opportunity without having a record that then permanently follows them for the remainder of their life.
Now, I'm getting a lot of questions in the chat about the company's cybersecurity hygiene. Questions about the role that multi-factor authentication played in here, why information at rest wasn't encrypted or may not have been encrypted. I'm hoping to turn to Wesley to start this off. Can you talk a little bit about PowerSchool's cybersecurity hygiene practices? What are the vulnerabilities that contributed to this attack, and what lessons can we all learn about, you know, the requirements or the need for a good cybersecurity hygiene practice?
Yeah, the lack of hygiene is pretty concerning because, you know, in information security, we have this concept of defense in depth, that you know that attackers are going to get through some defenses. So you want to layer in enough defenses that when they overcome one thing, you've got something else that can fill the gap. And so, you know, even beyond, you know, there's a lot of attention that we've paid to the MFA portion of those contract accounts. But, you know, even after those users or the attacker got access and authenticated, there's still all kinds of places where this could have been caught or prevented. So, you know, and it's one of the things where I would expect, you know, I'm on a small team. It's a medium-sized school district. We don't have a security person on staff. But we're still doing things like data loss protection and monitoring for anomalous behavior, just-in-time access, just enough access, those types of things where any one of those things could have either caught the problem in progress, in the case of like DLP. You know, if they have something that's alerting on the attacker exfiltrating, you know, I can't think of a legitimate use case for why there should be a single user who is accessing every district they have access to and basically selecting all from the student and teacher tables. And so I feel like there were failures kind of along the way of places where they could have, maybe not have stopped that initial access, but definitely as soon as the exfiltration started, should have been bells and whistles and all kinds of things kind of alerting that something was amiss.
Great. Now we're also seeing a lot of questions in the chat about vendors and vendor selection, and I hope to start at least with Mark Racine to talk about this. Can you elaborate a little bit about the challenges that schools like maybe the school district that you worked for face in selecting vendors? What do you do to ensure that the vendors that you're contracting with have stringent cybersecurity processes in place?
Yeah, and I ultimately there's only so much that we can do as a district, both in the amount that we can know about a company's security protocols, as well as the amount of time that we have in order to dedicate towards reviewing contracts and data privacy agreements. And across, at least with the districts I work with, dozens, if not hundreds of different vendors that have access to data. So I think the very first thing is you need to set some expectations that you as a district value cybersecurity and you're looking for certain protocols or certain things. We set, before I left Boston Public Schools, we set standards for our contractors and all of our vendors to meet in terms of securing our data. And we required single sign-on so that we could enforce MFA across all of our applications. It was shocking to me how many vendors don't support single sign-on or MFA. And there are some vendors that are SIS and HR system vendors that don't support these protocols yet. So as an industry, we have to raise the bar and set certain protocols that say, we're not going to work with vendors unless you meet our protocols. We do owe it to our vendors to come together and agree upon these things, because vendors cannot possibly meet individual needs of thousands and thousands of customers. But there are folks out there, ISTE, that has published some ways for us to see how these things work, or how compliance reports work out across their vendors. And we can start to say, this is what matters to us, and this is how we're going to measure it. Ultimately, though, you do have to have a level of trust in vendors. And so I think the next part of that is, as school districts, is to reduce the amount of information and data that we are providing to our vendors. PowerSchool is a really hard one because you have to put an enormous amount of data in your SIS. But your other vendors, are you cataloging all of your vendors that you work with and knowing what types of data you're giving to these vendors? And if you're putting sensitive information into that vendor, holding them to a higher level of scrutiny, as opposed to, maybe it's a third-party tool that doesn't necessarily need all of the student data in it. Can you minimize the amount of data that you send to the vendor? And therefore, you're reducing your risk. You can never eliminate it with vendors, and we can never eliminate having to work with vendors. But we can at least reduce the impact and the risk that we give ourselves through the data that we're providing to our vendors.
Yeah, I actually want to pose a similar question to Doug, because I know that he's been tracking the trends on data breaches and cyber attacks affecting the K-12 sector for a long time. And from my understanding, vendors play a pretty large role in the overall landscape of cyber risks that schools face. And schools certainly contract with a lot of a lot of vendors for a lot of services. Can you talk a little bit about the prevalence, the degree to which these vendors provide, create cyber risks for schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think what folks need to understand, if you're maybe not as close to K-12 on a day-to-day basis, clearly there's all the things that a teacher is using in the classroom with his or her students, all the classroom-focused apps. But over the last decade or so, schools have undergone really a digital transformation. And, frankly, all of their operations are driven by technology now. So whether you're talking about, HR processes, whether you're talking about facilities management, even physical security systems in schools, transportation and bus routing, management of medical information, special education, interface with juvenile justice, routing school buses and transportation, right? So, a typical school district is likely working, if not with thousands of different of vendors and suppliers, but hundreds, right? And what we have seen is sometimes access via what would seem to be an innocuous avenue, like an HVAC interface, can then be used to pivot to create much more havoc in a school system. I mean, I think where the other point I just want to make is that, this is not an issue that's unique to K-12. And there's a lot of other more highly regulated sectors that have been dealing with these issues a little bit longer than us. The issues of third-party risk management, issues of data minimization. These are fundamentally hard questions. And while we can look to things like a SOC 2 Type 2 or an ISO 27001 or some other list of a priori standards like alignment to a cybersecurity framework, but they all have been shown to be imperfect, right? We've seen in recent years the instantiation of something called SBOMs, software bills of materials, as a way to provide more insight. This is a fundamentally hard problem, but I think at the end of the day, just as there have been calls for school systems to uplift their cybersecurity practices, the sector is only as strong as its weakest link. In this case too, to be clear, this appears to have been a subcontractor of PowerSchool's, number one. And number two, it's important to note that PowerSchool as a company is, and I mean this mostly in a descriptive sense, a Frankenstein type company. They are an amalgamation of dozens of other companies they have acquired over time. They have had multiple owners over time. They had gone public, and then in October of 24, Bain took them private, which, as I understand it, Amelia, means that they're no longer subject to reporting requirements like at the SEC and other obligations they would have as a public company, right? So there's a lot of companies that have a lot of legacy tech. There's a lot of schools that have a lot of legacy tech. And it is a rare school district IT leader that built and architected their network themselves, as opposed to coming into something that somebody else built and may only have it imperfectly documented, right? To say nothing of shadow IT that individuals in the school system may be trying to stand up. These are fundamentally hard problems, but at the end of the day, we do need everybody to be doing better. Both our vendors, as well as the school systems. And I think this is a conversation that frankly has been too long a time in coming. And so hopefully that this incident will now kind of bring these kind of serious conversations that Mark suggested the sector needs to have to the forefront with superintendents, with chief financial officers as a core part of procurement.
Right. Now, pivoting a little bit back to obligations, Amelia, you spoke about the company's, legal obligations and requirements at this point. I'm hoping you can talk about what schools should do now. What are the steps that they need to take, and what can parents, students, educators do to hold their own school systems accountable to make sure that that they're kept in the loop?
I'm seeing a lot of comments that I think also reflect what I'm thinking, which is this is an example of a breach where school districts did absolutely nothing wrong and could not have prevented this in any way. Like school districts that were essentially hosting their own version of PowerSchool still had their data accessible by this subcontractor who had access to everyone's data. There isn't really a lesson for school districts here other than maybe please delete your social security numbers. Like it is time. But this is something where we need to push for additional enforcement. As I said, we have the laws. We clearly have here a company who promised things. They're one of the 12 companies that signed on to the CISA K-12 Education Technology Secure by Design pledge last year. If districts could rely on anything, I mean, certainly something, put forward by the federal government saying secure by design should be something that districts can rely on, because they can't vet everything. They can't enforce on their own. They can't initiate audits. They may be able to, contractually, but what school district has the money to go and force a vendor to show them all of their practices? I think in this case, looking at things like New York's great chief privacy officer, and the fact that she's, I believe, the only chief privacy officer, education chief privacy officer that can initiate audits at the state level. I know Utah has done incredible work similarly, trying to centralize this at the state level. That helps, but this breach really is an example of something where there are no steps. Now that it's happened, there are certainly things to look at. I would note that most states just started their legislative session. And so in addition to pushing for enforcement, record retention laws are horribly outdated in states. Part of the reason that PowerSchool likely had this much data from the past 20 years is because there are requirements in states predating the digital age that say, for example, in New Jersey, you have to keep the health information of students for 100 years. Obviously, that was in a time where we just meant the vaccination record of students and not the community health programs that we now provide. But these are the kinds of laws we're looking at. And you're never going to reach a point where you have true data minimization, where you make sure that, data that doesn't exist can't be breached. And so how do we remove some of that data that we don't need, but archaic laws are telling us we have to keep?
And Doug, how should school leaders and policymakers respond at this point? What should the incoming Trump administration, for example, do about this?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think at the end of the day, there's only so much that an individual school district is going to be able to do and figure out on their own. I think the reason, frankly, we're here, we have so many folks with us today, is that this is a sector-wide issue, right? And I think what we have been doing at K-12 6, we've been watching and documenting this issue over time. It's clearly getting, these issues are happening more frequently. They're clearly happening they're having much more significant impact. There's no reason to believe with the advent of AI and the continued data collection that school systems are doing, introduction of new vendors, right, that these issues won't continue to happen. So I think at the end of the day, the education sector is going to need to be held, frankly, to a standard befitting the sensitivity of the population we're serving, the data that we're collecting. That includes probably mandatory compliance requirements for school systems, frankly, as well as their vendors. I think Amelia is absolutely right. Enforcement, it is an enormous challenge. FERPA was, maybe FERPA could be updated at some point in, the next 20 or 30 years. That would be terrific. And then I think I would be remiss, terribly remiss, if I didn't point out that, this is a tremendous resource challenge for school systems. And unless we address that capacity issue right there, and I think in creative ways, because the notion that every school system is going to be able to go out into the market and buy, hire a CISO at market rates to be able to shore up their systems internally, I think is a fantasy. I don't think those individuals exist. I don't know that we could recruit them with public sector salaries. I think we're going to need to think about scaling some of these solutions at a regional level, maybe a state network level or a state level, or even regionally across states. I think there's a number of folks who are doing good work that could scale in that way. But we're going to need, honestly, we need school leaders, we need superintendents, we need school board members, parents, probably to be talking to their policymakers in states and at the federal level and asking for assistance and demanding better. And I think that will start to break things loose.
So here's an interesting audience question transparency for students and parents. the person wanted to know, how can students and parents know what type of information their schools hold about them, and what steps can they take now to secure that information?
I think it's a great question. Transparency is a very difficult balance because when what you communicate to your parents, you are also communicating to the public. And if there's somebody who wants to do harm against you, you need to be careful with how much you share with the bad guys. And we've seen plenty of examples where the bad guys are looking at school district websites to see what can I learn in order to carry out an attack. And so transparency is hard. And I think being able to explain that to parents, that we want to tell you as much as possible, we also want to make sure that the bad guys don't have the same level of detail. And so I think there's a balance between what you share during a public session, a public meeting, versus privately with your superintendent and school board, and just being candid about that with parents. Um, I think being able to also share what you are taking or what you are doing to respond to this is important. And it is really important for everybody, school districts and PowerSchool themselves, to share to parents that this was not the fault of school districts. But school districts can take advantage of this and say, we're very sorry that this happened. And while this was a failure of our vendor, here's what we are doing to hold all of our vendors accountable and raising the bar for this so that this doesn't happen to you again. Because at the end of the day, parents deserve a description from PowerSchool directly, but they also are owed a description of this from the school district themselves. And so as much as you can be transparent and open and communicative with your families, I think that's what families need right now, as hard as that might be.
On the legal side, FERPA, even though it is 50 years old, the conversations we were having then actually surprisingly reflect the conversations we're having now. Congress was debating a national consumer privacy law to protect from these frightening new data systems that were room full computers. And so you actually had some good elements there that provide protections today, at least in regards to things like transparency. Security is very much missing and FERPA needs to be amended. When it comes to transparency, you can go and say, what data are you collecting about my child? And the school has to provide that information. The school has to provide information in general. If you're like, okay, I would like to see my child's information about XYZ. There are occasionally some information that might not be shared, like if there's a video of a couple of students or something like that where another child's privacy could be endangered. It's a little more complicated, but there are rights that parents have in getting that transparency. There are rights that they have to challenge what is in their child's record. And then I think important outside of legal options, not underestimating sort of just local advocacy. There are some amazing parents in Maryland that managed to get their district to sign up to a data deletion day every year where they wiped out all of the information that they no longer needed, which included, for example, student monitoring data. That's incredible. That is something doable at a local level that can help more broadly here.
And just one last question to close up the session today. I hope to just open it up to the panelists and ask you, what haven't we discussed? What am I forgetting about? What lingering thoughts do each of you have that can contribute to the conversation?
I mean, if I can, what I would sort of start by saying again is this is not a problem that we're going to solve district by district or company by company. I really think that we have maybe not appreciated as a sector the cybersecurity risks that we've undertaken by embracing technology. For all of its benefits, I think we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years that there are cyber criminals out there, nation state actors, terrorists, who will use, their access to these technologies to cause harm. And the US in particular is a popular target worldwide for these sorts of incidents. The notion that schools are going to be able to defend themselves from actors coming from overseas who are essentially professional hackers, malicious hackers, I think is fantasy. Schools need help. I think there needs to be some assurances for parents that no matter where their kids are in school, there's some baseline of protections in place. That when schools are going out to bid for a new product, that their vendors are going to be held to a certain standard as well. And I think ultimately, we're not going to get to a place where these sorts of incidents never happen, but I think we need to get to a place where we can be more resilient and where these incidents are, our operations are less likely to be affected, but also the individual sort of dangers to individuals stemming from these incidents are muted because the information that folks are able to steal is less sensitive, or at least, at the very least, involves far fewer individuals.
I would advocate for using this as an example for ways that you can improve your own security within your organization, whether or not you're an ed tech provider or a school district. There's more things that we can do. And I've always said when I was in the district, never let a crisis go to waste. This is a perfect opportunity. And while there's a lot of questions out there around MFA in PowerSchool's use of MFA or maybe not, we all know that within K-12, we have a lot of work to do when it comes to MFA. And so what are you doing to make sure that all employees have MFA set up? Are you thinking about how you're going to roll out MFA to students? Because after all, those are accounts in your systems. And then what are we doing to get rid of old SFTP servers that use a simple username and password and have all this data sitting there? So there's a lot that we can do. And I think using the lessons learned from this, not to be angry with PowerSchool, but to think internally about what can we do to prevent ourselves from being the next PowerSchool, that's the important next step.
I'd love to emphasize the value of numbers here. So I will promote my dying day, the Student Data Privacy Consortium, which was started by districts, now has district participants from, I think it's maybe 33 states. The data privacy agreement I referenced earlier that includes requirements when it comes to security is their template, is something that was built by districts for districts. And it makes it a lot easier, at least on that contractual side, for a district that maybe has less than 1,000 students, which, by the way, is 50% of districts. We need to give more support and centralized resources like STPC, education service agencies, and others are absolutely, I think, the right resources to send money to so that districts can rely and get the support that they need.
Yeah, and as just kind of a takeaway too, it's a great reminder about that shared responsibility model that, even though PowerSchool had the servers and everything, it's our data. Our teachers, our students, they gave us the data and not PowerSchool. So it's a good reminder, with so much of our life that lives in SaaS applications that, even if there was nothing that the schools could have done, possibly, we're still responsible for the data.
Right, and on that, I just want to say huge thanks to Amelia, Doug, Mark, and Wesley for coming on and sharing your expertise for folks, and thanks to everybody in the audience for joining us today, for asking all of these really great questions. I know that folks at K-12-6 have a few last-minute housekeeping items, but that's it. Thanks to everybody for coming today.
Thank you, Mark, for partnering with us to host today's webinar. Thanks as well to Amelia, Wesley, and Mark Racine for joining us on very short notice. I think this is just one of those special instances where it was important for us to be quick and get out good, reliable information and thoughts to as many people as we could. I've seen a number of questions about whether this will be recorded. This is recorded. We will send out a link to that recording to everybody who registered, as well as have that posted on our website where you can go and grab that for the foreseeable future. Look for additional information from us and resources from the presenters here as well, which we'll send to you. And then finally, we are always interested in your feedback. Feel free to follow that QR code. I promise we are not phishing you. It'll just going to bring you to a Microsoft form with a simple evaluation for today's webinar. But otherwise, we just want to thank everyone for coming today, for taking time out of your day to join us. Mark Kierlieber, I suspect that we can look to you for some additional reporting on this issue going forward, I hope.
Yeah, hopefully, more to come. And for school leaders, you know, if you are dealing with any cybersecurity issues and you want to talk about it, I'm at the 74, so please reach out.
Right. Send your tips and leads to Mark at the 74. Well, thank you all. Appreciate your time again. And thanks again to the panelists today. Have a great day, everyone.